I was born with an appetite that never fit inside me. Other children filled their plates and sighed with contentment. I scraped mine clean and still stared at the scraps on theirs. I envied the dogs gnawing bones in the alley, the crows tearing at roadkill on the street. No matter how much I ate, the hunger remained. My mother thought I was ill. "A growing boy," she said to the neighbors, laughing nervously as I asked for thirds. But she couldn't see the way my eyes lingered on her cutting board, not at the vegetables or the bread, but at the raw meat glistening in its juices. I loved the smell of it, the slick sound when her knife parted fat and sinew. I was 7 the first time I pressed a strip of uncooked beef to my tongue. She turned away to stir the pot, and I slipped it between my teeth. It was cold, metallic, almost sweet. I chewed slowly, my mouth filling with something I couldn't name then. Satisfaction. Animals came next. A neighbor's cat that slunk too close to my window one night. I didn't set out to kill it. I only wanted to touch it, to feel its muscles ripple under my grip. But when it clawed at me, instinct surged. My hands were on its throat before I even thought about it. The life drained out of it in seconds. I should have been horrified. I should have cried. Instead, I cut it open behind the shed and tasted its flesh. It was stringy, bitter, unpleasant. But it taught me something vital. That meat alone wasn't enough. I wanted people. That thought bloomed slowly, like mold spreading unseen across bread. In school, when teachers droned on, I would stare at the children around me and wonder. The plumpness of their arms, the round softness of their thighs. I imagined slicing, searing, serving. My notebooks filled not with lessons but with sketches of knives, diagrams of cuts, fantasies of butchery hidden behind childish doodles. No one suspected. Why would they? I was quiet, polite, eager to help in the kitchen whenever food was being prepared. By the time I was a teenager, I had already decided my path. Culinary school wasn't just a career choice. It was camouflage. There, surrounded by knives and flame, I finally felt at home. Other students practiced for exams. I practiced for inevitability. I studied the human body the way others studied textbooks, learning from anatomy books in the library, diagrams of muscle groups, the way tendons clung to bone. At night, I dreamed of carving, of plating flesh so tender it quivered under the knife. The first time I tasted human meat, I was 23. It wasn't planned. Nothing so grand. Just a man in an alley, drunk and staggering, who picked the wrong stranger to harass. He grabbed me, shoved me against a wall, and sneered about what he'd do to me. I don't remember deciding. I only remember the knife in my hand, and the sudden warmth as it slid into him. His eyes went wide, then glassy. I dragged him into the shadows, heart racing, but not with fear, with hunger. The blood steamed in the cold night air. I cut a piece from his thigh, raw and dripping, and brought it to my lips. It was everything I had imagined. Tender. Rich. A taste that made the rest of the world seem pale and meaningless. I took more, wrapped it in my jacket, carried it home, cooked it slowly in butter with garlic and herbs. The smell filled my apartment, intoxicating. When I ate, I felt whole for the first time in my life. That was the night the hunger changed. Ordinary food disgusted me afterward. Pork, beef, chicken, all ash in my mouth. Only human flesh satisfied. And once you discover what you were meant to eat, how can you ever go back? I didn't. Not after that first night. Not after feeling the warmth of life melt into the butter. Not after tasting the subtle sweetness, the impossible tenderness. Ordinary meals became a mockery, a charade. I couldn't touch another slab of meat without thinking of what it wasn't. I spent hours wandering the streets afterward, imagining, planning, cataloging possibilities. I became patient. I had to. Desire alone would have destroyed me, made me careless. I watched people. I observed their habits, their routines. The drunkards, the wanderers, the lost souls who no one would notice missing. I mapped their streets in my mind. I learned which alleys were quiet at night, which doors unlocked too easily, which hands trembled with trust. Each became a potential ingredient, each a canvas. At home, I converted the apartment into a laboratory, a shrine. Knives lined the walls like instruments in a temple. Cutting boards were replaced with surfaces I could sterilize and sanitize obsessively. I started cataloging meat in ways I had only imagined. Texture, fat content, tenderness. I experimented with cooking techniques. Slow roast, sear, braise, poach. Every method highlighted different qualities. Fear, I discovered, left a metallic tang. Calm, though. Calm made the meat supple, nearly delicate. I began small. Drifters who stumbled into the wrong street, wandering men too inebriated to protest. I lured them gently, calmly. A hand offered, a quiet word. They followed me willingly, hungry, tired, lonely, and that, I learned, made the preparation far easier. Their fear would rise, but I learned to soothe it, whisper to them, tell them it was okay, even as I carved the life from them. Every cut, every slice was studied. I memorized the way muscles separated from bone, the subtle marbling that made some flesh melt in the pan while others required careful braising. I rendered fat into butter. I made stock from bones. I minced scraps into a kind of crude pâté, experimenting until the flavor was exact. Nothing wasted, nothing left to chance. Culinary school had prepared me for this more than anyone could imagine. Anatomy, knife skills, understanding of texture and fat. They were all lessons in preparation for the one ingredient that mattered. My professors praised my discipline, my finesse, my innovative flair, and I let them. They had no idea that my experiments had already surpassed anything they could imagine. They were children playing at cuisine, while I had discovered perfection in flesh. As the years passed, my methods became more refined. I learned how to select my victims. Age, diet, occupation, temperament, all influenced flavor. The young were tender, sweet, mild. The strong and muscular were rich, earthy, almost game-like. Illness tainted the meat slightly bitter. Fear tainted it metallic. I became a connoisseur, a scholar of the most forbidden cuisine. I kept meticulous notes: date, preparation method, taste, texture, aroma. Hunting became a ritual. I studied their movements, learned their vulnerabilities. I learned which neighborhoods were silent, which streets smelled of opportunity. I lured them with subtle kindness, a word, a smile, a promise of food, warmth, attention. And when the moment came, it was precise, clinical, controlled. I didn't kill out of rage. I killed to create, to perfect, to complete the ritual that began the moment they entered my apartment. The first time I served it to someone else, it was unintentional. A friend of mine, curious about the aromas coming from my kitchen, insisted on tasting my new recipe. I had prepared a small portion, wrapped carefully, seared lightly with herbs and butter. He took the bite, chewed thoughtfully, smiled. The flavor was subtle, tender, richer than anything he had known. I watched, silent, as he praised it. And for the first time, I realized the power I held. I could craft the experience of life and death, flavor and pleasure, all on a single plate. From that night, I understood that the world itself was naive. People were blind to the truth, blind to the possibilities that lay beneath their very noses. And I had discovered a secret that would never be undone. I was the chef, the artist, the curator of life itself, and all the world could do was taste, consume, and never understand. My obsession deepened. I built freezers, hooks, jars, and racks. I kept bones for stock, fat for cooking, scraps for experiments. I experimented constantly with preparation, with presentation. I discovered subtleties: a brief marinade softened sinew, a low flame coaxed tenderness from tougher cuts. I began naming them, not out of respect, but out of the thrill of possession. Every ingredient was mine, every flavor a memory of what they were, what I had taken. And still, the hunger never ceased. It grows with satisfaction, always, Each bite whets it further. Each act of preparation sharpens it. Culinary perfection and the desire for human flesh became inseparable, a symphony of obsession, control, and horror. I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. There was no return to ordinary life, no forgiveness, no redemption. Only the cold steel of knives, the warmth of flesh, the intoxicating scent of cooking, and the eternal hunger that defined me. As time went on, I realized that I could not live like a solitary predator forever. The hunger was not only physical, it was creative, almost spiritual. I needed an outlet, a canvas. The kitchen was no longer merely a place to cook. It was a stage, an altar, a gallery where I displayed the results of my devotion. I began to perfect the art of selection. Not all prey was equal. Youth brought tenderness, yes, but too young. And the flavor was bland. Age brought depth, a richness, complexity, but too old. And the meat was tough, dry, bitter. Diet, activity level, health. Each nuance added a subtle note to the palate. I learned to read people like cookbooks, judging the quality of flesh before the act had even begun. Preparation became ritualistic. The apartment smelled of cleaning chemicals, of simmering broths, of searing fat. Knives were sharpened meticulously, cutting boards scrubbed until they gleamed. When I drew them close, when I whispered soft reassurances, it was as much about control as compassion. Fear left a metallic taste, one I had to manage carefully. They had to be alive enough for the meat to hold its integrity, yet calm enough to yield the most supple texture. Sometimes I experimented raw. A thin slice, barely warmed, seasoned with only a pinch of salt. The flavors revealed themselves fully this way, unmasked by sauces or spices. Later, I would braise, roast, sear, poach, each method revealing something new. The difference between thighs and shoulders, between belly and rib, became an obsession. My notebooks filled with charts, observations, minute details. I became a scholar of flesh, a connoisseur of life itself. It was not merely eating, it was communion. Each meal, each preparation, was a conversation with death. I could taste the fear, the strength, the fleeting moments of their last memories, and it flavored the dish in ways that no chef could replicate with ordinary ingredients. I began to catalog the experiences: the drunkard who smelled of stale alcohol and sweat, the young man whose flesh carried the sharpness of adolescent vigor, the lonely old woman whose meat was mellow, rich with quiet resignation, and still, the hunger never relented. I became more ambitious. The streets, the alleys, the dark corners where no one watched, they were insufficient. I needed more control, more consistency, more predictability. I began to plan. Invitations, lures, careful manipulations. A smile here, a word there, a promise of warmth, of food, of friendship. They followed willingly, unaware that the ultimate menu had been written long before they arrived. The kitchen became my sanctuary. Hooks lined the walls, freezers stacked with careful precision, jars of stock and fat gleaming like trophies. Bones were simmered, scraps minced, fat rendered. Every act was deliberate, every ingredient honored. I learned to balance flavors, subtlety and strength, tenderness and texture. I learned to season with thought, to craft a dish that spoke of life, of death, of transformation. I began to imagine taking it further. Not just private indulgences, not just solitary dinners, but something more ambitious. A restaurant, a place where I could channel the perfection of my craft into a public display, a celebration. Of course, it had to be hidden. No one could know. Yet the thought excited me. The idea of sharing, teaching, influencing. To watch strangers praise something that was literally born of my obsession. The thrill was almost unbearable. I became meticulous in planning. Routes, timing, schedules. I studied patterns of disappearance, learning which people no one would miss. I refined my methods, always seeking to preserve the quality of the flesh. Fear, excitement, age, diet, all became variables in a science of taste. I had become both predator and chef, scholar and artist. And in the quiet of my apartment, late at night, when the world slept and only the hum of the refrigerator accompanied me, I would sometimes trace the knife across the counter and remember the first time. That alley, that raw, warm bite, and feel the hunger stir anew. It would never go away, and I would not want it to, because now it is who I am. Eventually, the apartment could no longer contain the ambition. The knives and hooks, the freezers and jars, the meticulous notes. These were not enough. I needed a stage, a place where my work could breathe, where the art of flesh could be appreciated. That was when the idea of a restaurant took root. Of course, it had to appear normal. A high-end bistro, exclusive and tasteful, with a name that hinted at refinement. Candles, dim lighting, a carefully curated wine list. Every detail designed to distract from the truth, to lure the unsuspecting into my domain. Patrons would comment on the subtle aromas, the delicate textures, the balance of flavors. They praised me, unaware that the essence of life had passed through my hands before arriving on their plates. Preparation became an intricate dance. I sourced ingredients with extreme caution, ensuring freshness, tenderness, and consistency. A young man, a transient worker, a lonely woman, each brought a unique palate to my table. I learned to respect the variability, adjusting cooking times, seasoning, and technique to bring out the perfection hidden within. Fear and excitement were manipulated subtly, for these nuances left their mark on the flavor. The first time I served a full dish of human flesh, it was nearly ceremonial. I had spent hours preparing it, braising slowly, seasoning with nothing more than salt and a touch of rosemary. When the plate was set before a patron, I watched discreetly as they lifted the fork, unaware of the nature of what they were about to consume. They moaned softly, eyes closing in pleasure. I smiled, my hands clean, my conscience serene. It was not murder. It was creation. It was art. Each service became a ritual. I learned to pace the hunger, to orchestrate the act of eating as one would a symphony. Appetizers prepared attention, sides enhanced texture, sauces masked or revealed, depending on the cut. I cataloged responses, noting expressions, the subtle shifts in posture, the sounds of indulgence. Each diner unknowingly contributed to the refinement of my craft. And yet, the hunger persisted. It never dulled, never lessened. I craved the process as much as the taste, the selection, the capture, the preparation, the presentation. I became more precise, more deliberate, more obsessive. I recorded every detail, not for profit, but for mastery. Age, body composition, diet, fear, disposition, everything influenced the final dish. I became a scholar of flesh, an archivist of flavor, a god in my own private temple. But obsession has consequences. I began to notice patterns, small mistakes that could expose me. A missing person, a curious neighbor, a too inquisitive delivery man. Paranoia became constant, a shadow that lingered in every corner of my mind. I reinforced security, adjusted routines, manipulated perception. Everything had to be perfect. The world could never know the truth behind my art. Still, I justified it. Philosophically, morally, aesthetically. Humans, I told myself, are the most honest ingredient. They are complex, nuanced, varied in ways no other meat can achieve. To consume them is not to destroy, but to honor. Each preparation preserves a moment, a life, a unique combination of experience and being. In this way, I was a curator, a preserver, a master of truth hidden in flesh. Even as my fame grew, I remained vigilant. The world is naive, easily distracted by appearances, flavor, and presentation. They could not see the reality of the kitchen behind the doors, The hooks, the freezers, the meticulous charts of anatomy and taste. They would never understand. And that was precisely how I intended it. Late at night, after the last diner had left and the lights were dimmed, I would wander through the kitchen, touching the knives, inspecting the freezers, tracing the lines of the counters. I would open a jar, breathe in the aroma of a carefully preserved stock, and feel the hunger stir anew. Each scent, each sound, each memory sharpened it. It would never leave me. I would never want it to. Because this hunger is more than desire. It is identity. It is creation. It is the only truth I have ever known. And now, you are reading this, aren't you? I can almost smell your curiosity. Don't worry, I won't stop here. There is still so much to perfect. The kitchen waits, the knives gleam. The next meal is always just beginning. I began to take greater risks. The world is sloppy, careless, full of holes waiting to be exploited. I no longer relied solely on the invisible, the lonely, the forgotten. I studied the wealthy, the smug, the overconfident. They are easier to manipulate because they think themselves untouchable. A gentle word, a glass of wine, a promise of a special tasting in my private kitchen. And they follow. Their trust, their entitlement, makes the process effortless. The hunt itself became an art form. I observed the way they moved, how they walked, what they carried. I noted the subtle patterns in their daily lives. Even in crowded streets, even in bright daylight, I could predict their vulnerability. A misstep, a lapse in attention, a single door left unlocked, and the opportunity was mine. I refined the act of preparation, treating it as a sacred ritual. First, the selection of tools. Knives honed to perfection, sterilized and gleaming. Hooks installed with precision to suspend what I would work upon. Countertops scrubbed, the air clear of distracting scents. Every detail mattered. Even the sound of the blade against bone was orchestrated for efficiency and consistency. I experimented constantly, braising for tenderness, searing for flavor, slow roasting for richness. I discovered that a touch of certain herbs, rosemary, thyme, a whisper of garlic, could accentuate the natural flavors, enhancing rather than disguising the essence. The subtleties of preparation became as vital as the act itself. I kept meticulous records: age, weight, muscle tone, diet, fear level, even mood, all recorded and analyzed. I became a scholar of the human form, a scientist of its flavors. I discovered correlations: the fearful taste faintly metallic, the calm taste richer, more balanced, the exuberant taste almost sweet, like marrow and cream. Nothing was left to chance. My obsession grew alongside my skill. I began to dream in cuts and textures. Even in sleep, I was slicing, braising, seasoning. I woke with the scent of blood on my tongue, the tang of iron in my nose. I started to talk to the meat as I cooked, whispering praises, compliments, instructions. Some part of me believed that acknowledging it, honoring it, improved it, made it more perfect. Isolation became necessary. I no longer trusted anyone. Not the neighbors, not the delivery men, not the curious patrons. Surveillance became routine. Cameras, locks, subtle reinforcements of the apartment and the private kitchen. Every visitor had to pass layers of precaution, and still, I remained vigilant. Even a small mistake could destroy everything I had built. And yet, the hunger never dulled. It deepened. Each act of creation, each perfect plate, whetted it further. Each preparation, each ritual, each bite consumed only increased the need, the obsession, the madness. I was no longer simply a chef. I was something else, something beyond normality, beyond morality, beyond comprehension. The philosophy I had built to rationalize it grew with me. Humans, I told myself, are the ultimate ingredient. We are complexity embodied, experience made flesh. To consume is not destruction. It is preservation, elevation, transformation. Each dish is a memorial, a celebration, a continuation. Through cooking and consumption, life persists, art persists, truth persists. Paranoia and obsession blended into one. Every stranger could be a threat or a resource. Every shadow, a danger. Every sound, a signal. The hunger was omnipresent, gnawing, whispering. I became meticulous to the point of mania. The knives were always sharp, the counters always clean, the freezers always stocked. My notes grew into volumes. Detailed analyses of texture, taste, preparation techniques, correlations with behavior and mood. I was a priest, a scientist, a god, a monster. Yet, in quiet moments, I understood that the world had no name for what I had become. If discovered, I would be vilified, demonized, condemned. But in the silence of the kitchen, with the knives laid out and the meat waiting, there was only clarity, only perfection, only hunger, and I would not deny it. The restaurant was no longer just a place to feed others. It became a theater, a stage where I orchestrated every sensory detail. The lighting, the music, the aroma, all manipulated to prepare the palate, to prime the mind, to enhance the experience of consumption. Patrons marveled at the subtle flavors, the perfect textures, the unimaginable creativity in my dishes. They never suspected the truth. They never could. I became brazen, selective, and meticulous in equal measure. The hunt, once opportunistic, became strategic. I observed, studied, calculated. The lonely woman who lived on the edge of town, the overconfident executive who ignored the world around him, the young couple seeking adventure. They all became ingredients in my living menu. The thrill was in anticipation, in preparation, in the quiet planning that preceded each act. When they arrived, I welcomed them with charm, courtesy, and a practiced smile. They did not see the glint in my eyes, the weight of the knife behind my back, the intricate charts in my mind. Every step was rehearsed, every gesture calculated. Their trust, their ease, was essential for the perfection of the final dish. Fear was allowed only in subtle doses, enough to enrich the flavor, never enough to ruin it. Preparation became ritual. I dissected with precision, studied the anatomy, separated sinew from muscle, fat from flesh. Cooking was worship. The flames coaxed out flavor. Herbs enhanced it. Time and temperature were my instruments. Even the rendering of fat became a meditation. Every scrap of marrow, every scrap of muscle was valued, preserved, honored. Nothing was wasted, nothing ignored. I began to experiment with presentation, to elevate the act from sustenance to art. Platters were arranged with care, garnished sparingly, every cut aligned to create visual harmony. Patrons marveled, oblivious, savoring the nuanced flavors without knowing the origin of the ingredients. I watched them, silent, savoring not only the taste, but the perfection of the act itself. The hunger, however, never waned. Each meal sharpened it, each preparation intensified it. I became obsessed not merely with taste, but with control, with mastery, with the unbroken chain of life transformed into art on a plate. Each dish was both a triumph and a torment. It satisfied, yet only created more desire. I began keeping a private ledger, cataloging every detail: age, diet, musculature, temperament, fear, mood, and how it affected flavor. I noted cooking methods, times, temperatures, seasoning. I tracked reactions, subtle changes in expression, shifts in posture, the sounds of indulgence. Everything was data. Everything was part of the science, the obsession. Isolation became absolute. Every visitor, every delivery, every passerby had to be evaluated. Cameras, locks, subtle modifications to the space, all reinforced the sanctity of my temple. The apartment, the kitchen, the freezers, they were extensions of my mind, carefully controlled environments where nothing could spoil, nothing could escape, and no one could uncover the truth. And yet, I was not alone in my mind. The hunger whispered constantly, a shadow that never faded. It demanded attention, demanded satisfaction, demanded more. I could not ignore it. I could not escape it. I would not. Each act, each preparation, each meal fed the obsession, but never slaked the desire. It was eternal, relentless, beautiful, and horrifying. I began to rationalize further. Humans, I convinced myself, are the pinnacle of culinary expression. Each life is a complex ingredient, a nuanced combination of experience, genetics, and spirit. To consume is not to destroy. It is to honor, to preserve, to elevate. Each dish is a memorial, a celebration, a continuation of what once was. Through preparation, through ritual, through consumption, I achieved truth. Paranoia and mania intertwined. Every stranger could be prey. Every familiar face could betray me. Even those I served, those I trusted, were variables in the experiment. The knives, the hooks, the freezers, the records, they were the only constants in a chaotic, unpredictable world. And in that constancy, I found clarity. I found purpose. I found perfection. At night, I would wander through my apartment, tracing the blades, inspecting the racks, breathing in the aroma of stock and seared meat. Each scent, each sound, each memory sharpened the hunger, strengthened the obsession. It would never leave me. It could not. It was not merely appetite. It was identity, creation, obsession, and truth. The world will never understand. It cannot. And that, I realized, was precisely how it should be. I am the chef, the predator, the artist, the god of flesh and flavor. And this is my confession, though it changes nothing. The knives gleam. The kitchen waits. The next meal is always beginning. Even with all precautions, mistakes began to surface. A careless delivery, a neighbor who lingered too long, a patron whose curiosity was sharper than expected. Each small slip was a reminder that perfection is impossible, but I could not tolerate imperfection. I became hyper-vigilant, obsessive beyond reason. Locks, alarms, cameras, even subtle distractions, every detail reinforced. Nothing could be left to chance. Yet the hunger never relented. Each meal sharpened it. Each preparation heightened the craving. I began to feel almost addicted to the act itself. The lure, the capture, the preparation, the ritual of serving. Cooking was no longer a craft. It was a drug. The flavor, the texture, the scent, all became intoxicating, a high I could never reach with ordinary food. The restaurant became my stage for perfection. Every dish was a calculated masterpiece, every ingredient selected with the precision of a surgeon. Patrons whispered praises, marveled at the subtle flavors, the complexity, the textures that seemed impossible. I watched them savor every bite, oblivious to the origin, and felt a dark, exquisite satisfaction. They consumed without understanding, and in that ignorance lay the ultimate triumph. I began to experiment with presentation in even more twisted ways. Plates were arranged to reflect life and death, slices aligned to suggest the form of the body it had come from. Garnishes mimicked veins or sinews, sauces traced patterns like blood trails. It was grotesque and yet elegant. I delighted in the duality, the horror hidden beneath refinement, the terror masked by beauty. Paranoia grew into mania. Every sound outside, every knock at the door, every unusual glance became a threat or an opportunity. I refined the hunting process further, studying potential victims with surgical attention. Age, weight, musculature, temperament, all documented meticulously. I experimented with timing, preparation, even psychological manipulation, learning which methods produced the most tender, flavorful results. And yet, even as mastery grew, so did the madness. I began to talk to the meat while I worked, whispering praises, encouragement, guidance. Sometimes I imagined conversations with those who were gone, interpreting their silence as consent, their absence as approval. The kitchen became my confessional, my temple, my asylum. Within those walls, I was God, priest, artist, and predator, all at once. But nothing lasts forever. One night, a patron lingered too long after the meal. Questions arose. Observations were made. A suspicion whispered in my direction. My careful veil of normalcy, the illusion of a respectable chef, began to fray. I became frantic, cleaning obsessively, rearranging records, hiding evidence, pacing in a fever of anticipation. The knives gleamed in the dim light, their reflection like eyes watching me, judging me, urging me onward. It was then I realized the truth. The hunger is eternal, but the world is mortal. People notice, patterns emerge, mistakes happen. There is no perfection in the human sphere, only in isolation, control, and obsession. I accepted this with a grim serenity. The act of creation, the consumption, the perfection of flesh and flavor, these were mine alone. And if the world intruded, it would be swallowed by the very art it could never comprehend. The rituals intensified. Each hunt, each preparation, each meal was more deliberate than the last. I cataloged, observed, refined, and savored. Preparation was worship. Cooking was devotion. Consumption was communion. Every sensory detail mattered: the aroma, the texture, the sight, the sound. Patrons remained oblivious, but I knew the truth. I had crossed into a realm they could never enter, and in that, I found both pride and solace. At night, after the last customer departed, I would wander through the kitchen, touching knives, inspecting counters, breathing in the lingering scent of stock, seared meat, and butter. The hunger whispered, urging me onward, promising perfection with each new act, each new victim. And I obeyed. I could not resist. I would never resist. The final truth settled over me like a mantle. I am not merely a chef. I am creator, curator, predator, and priest. The world cannot see me, cannot understand, cannot know. The knives gleam, the fire burns, and the next meal waits. And in the quiet, I smile, because the hunger will never leave me. It is who I am. It is my purpose. And the kitchen, my cathedral, will endure, eternal, perfect, and unspeakably beautiful. It became ritualistic, almost ceremonial. Each victim was chosen not only for taste, but for the way they would serve the perfection I sought. The hunt, the capture, the preparation, all were rehearsed, precise, sacred. I had become the architect of life and death, and every plate was a monument to my obsession. I started inviting select patrons into my private kitchen, under the guise of an exclusive tasting. I presented dishes with the same meticulous care as always, slices arranged perfectly, sauces drawn in intricate patterns, herbs applied with surgical precision. They marveled at the flavors, whispered praises, never realizing that the essence of their delight had come from lives I had taken. Some of them, curious, asked questions. I smiled and answered vaguely, my tone casual, almost mocking. The thrill of being so close to discovery only sharpened my senses. Every creak, every whisper, every shadow became part of the ritual. I began to manipulate my victims psychologically before the act, coaxing, soothing, sometimes frightening just enough to enhance the flavor without ruining the tenderness. Their compliance, their unwitting contribution to the process, was intoxicating. The kitchen became my universe. Hooks lined the walls like sentinels. Freezers hummed with anticipation. Jars of stock and fat glistened like jewels. I could spend hours there, just observing, cleaning, whispering to the ingredients, preparing for the next act of creation. I had become both priest and altar, god and worshipper, predator and artist. And still, the hunger grew. Satisfaction was fleeting. Each act, each meal, only stoked the fire higher. Ordinary food disgusted me. human flesh alone nourished and fulfilled. I began to see patterns, subtle differences, almost imperceptible nuances in flavor that revealed themselves only to the truly devoted. Age, diet, temperament, fear, they all left their mark. I studied them like a scholar, tasted them like a connoisseur, cataloged them like a scientist. I began to see the world differently. Ordinary people, oblivious to the reality behind the meals they consumed, became ingredients, moving through life unaware. Every interaction, every handshake, every smile was an opportunity. The boundary between preparation and hunting blurred. Every meal became part of an eternal cycle. Every act of consumption a tribute to the perfection I pursued. Paranoia, however, became a constant companion. Mistakes were unforgivable. Too many disappearances, too many questions, even the faintest suspicion could destroy everything. I reinforced locks, monitored cameras, refined routines. Every step, every gesture, every cut was calculated. Nothing could be left to chance. Then, one night, I realized that perfection itself demanded escalation. No longer could I be content with small selections, with drifters and lonely souls. I needed challenges, complexity, layers of flavor, tenderness, and texture that only experience, strength, and age could provide. I began targeting those whose disappearance would cause attention, precisely because the risk sharpened my craft, honed my senses, intensified the flavor. The acts became ritualistic performances. I moved silently, efficiently, surgically. Knives gleamed under dim light. Hooks waited patiently. Freezers hummed. Every movement was deliberate, choreographed, essential. When the act was complete, I prepared the flesh with care, seasoning only with the smallest touches, allowing the natural essence to dominate. Each plate was a testament to obsession, mastery, and the dark beauty of life transformed into sustenance. And in those moments, as diners lifted forks unaware, moaned softly in pleasure, complimented flavors beyond imagination, I felt the ultimate satisfaction. The world could never know. They would never understand. Yet they consumed, praised, and adored what I had wrought. Finally, there was clarity. The hunger is eternal, the obsession infinite. Life and death, flavor and fear, creation and destruction. They exist in perfect balance only in my hands. The knives gleam. The kitchen waits. The freezers hum with anticipation. And I, predator and priest, artist and god, continue, unchallenged, unrepentant, and utterly consumed by what I am. Because this is not mere appetite. This is identity. This is perfection. This is truth. And the next meal is always beginning. The thrill of the hunt became almost unbearable. I no longer waited for opportunity to present itself. I created it. A stray comment overheard, a glance misread, a smile returned. Each could be manipulated, nudged, twisted into compliance. I would follow them, unseen, noting patterns, habits, weaknesses. A man's posture could tell me how strong he was. A woman's gait could reveal subtle tension in her muscles. Everything mattered. Every detail influenced the final flavor. When the moment arrived, it was clinical. There was no hesitation. The knife felt natural in my hand, extensions of my fingers, attuned to the rhythm of flesh, sinew, and bone. The act of taking life was not violent for its own sake. It was necessary, sacred. I whispered reassurances as I worked, soft words that calmed the body even as the knife moved. Fear was a seasoning, not a contaminant. Too much, and the texture would spoil. Too little, and the meat lacked depth. Once the act was complete, the real ritual began. I moved with precision, separating sinew from muscle, trimming fat, rendering marrow, preparing cuts for cooking. Knives sang over cutting boards, the metallic scent of blood mixing with the sharper tang of iron and copper in the air. I marinated, braised, seared, roasted, experimented endlessly with heat, time, and seasoning. Each cut became a lesson, each dish a triumph of obsession and skill. Presentation became an art unto itself. Slices aligned to mimic life, sauces drawn in lines reminiscent of veins, garnishes placed as if to honor the fallen. Patrons, my unwitting audience, praised the dishes without understanding the horror behind them. Some were effusive, others subtle in their admiration. I cataloged every reaction, noting expressions, posture, even breath. The slightest change was data for refinement for the next performance. Paranoia coiled ever tighter around my mind. A careless glance from a neighbor, an inquisitive waiter, a curious patron. Every anomaly could unravel years of secrecy. I reinforced locks, inspected cameras, adjusted routines, even manipulated mundane events to maintain control. Each precaution became ritualistic, another layer in the symphony of obsession that defined my existence. The hunger, however, never diminished. It grew sharper, more insistent. Even after a full plate, even after a night spent feasting on carefully prepared flesh, it returned, gnawing, whispering, driving me to create more, to hunt more, to perfect the art that had become my life. I became addicted not merely to flavor, but to the act itself, the orchestration, the manipulation, the creation, the communion with life and death. I began to experiment further with psychological manipulation. Fear could be modulated to enhance flavor. Anticipation could heighten tenderness. Resignation could bring richness. A soft word here, a gesture there, a moment of feigned trust or comfort. All could influence the body, the muscles, the subtle chemical reactions that shape the taste. I became not only predator and chef, but scientist and artist, sculpting the perfect dining experience from living subjects. At night, in the quiet of my kitchen, I would stand over my preparations, knives in hand, freezers humming, stock simmering, and feel a kind of transcendence. Each act, each ritual, each carefully executed step was a meditation, a connection to something larger than life itself. I spoke softly to the meat, sometimes imagining conversations, sometimes whispering prayers, sometimes giving thanks. It was all part of the ritual, part of the obsession, part of the perfection I pursued relentlessly. Then came the moments of near discovery, the razor's edge of risk that made the art even more intoxicating. A neighbor lingered too long outside a window. A deliveryman asked too many questions. A patron lingered after hours, curious about the private kitchen. Each brush with exposure sharpened my mind, honed my skills, and deepened my obsession. Mistakes were unacceptable. Perfection was mandatory. I began to imagine my work on an even grander scale. Not just solitary preparation, not just private meals, but a world where the art of flesh was celebrated, appreciated, feared, and revered. The thought thrilled me. The control, the mastery, the absolute dominance over life, flavor, and death. I would be immortalized through taste, through ritual, through fear, through secrecy. The world would never see, but it would consume. And so I continued. Hunt, prepare, cook, serve. Each step, each bite, each act a note in a symphony of obsession. The knives gleamed, the fire burned, the freezers hummed with anticipation. Every moment was calculated, every detail precise, every flavor perfected. The hunger was eternal, insatiable, exquisite. I had become more than human. I was predator, priest, artist, god. Life and death were my instruments, flesh and fear my medium, obsession and hunger my constant companions. And in the quiet, as the city slept unaware outside my walls, I understood the ultimate truth. The next meal is never the last. The next meal is always beginning. The kitchen had become a cathedral of obsession. Hooks lined the walls like silent sentinels. Freezers hummed with the promise of future creations, and knives lay gleaming in precise formation, ready to carve perfection. I no longer relied solely on a single victim at a time. Multiple preparations allowed me to explore contrasts in texture, flavor, and tenderness, a symphony of flesh that could only exist in secrecy. I selected them carefully, a young man with firm, sweet muscle, an older woman whose flesh carried depth and richness, a transient worker whose fear injected a metallic tang into the meat. Each brought something unique to the table, and I cataloged every nuance, every reaction, every subtle chemical trace that would influence the final taste. The hunt became almost theatrical. I manipulated their routines, guided their paths, orchestrated encounters that ensured both compliance and optimal flavor. A whispered word, a false promise, a gesture of kindness or fear, all became instruments. They did not resist. Some even trusted me. Their trust was the final seasoning. In the kitchen, preparation became ritual. Hooks held the bodies just so, each cut calculated for tenderness and presentation. I traced the lines of their muscles with my fingers, noting the differences, marveling at the variation, whispering encouragement as I worked. Knives sang, carving sinew and fat with precision. Blood, rendered fat, marrow, muscle. They all contributed to the aroma that filled the room. Intoxicating, electrifying, sacred. I experimented endlessly. One body slow roasted with herbs to accentuate depth, another poached to preserve delicate textures, another seared to maintain richness while creating a crisp exterior. The flavors spoke to me, communicated in ways that only a devoted scholar of flesh could understand. I tasted constantly, refining, adjusting, perfecting. Each bite informed the next, each plate a note in a symphony of obsession. Paranoia had become second nature. Cameras, locks, alarms, redundant systems. Every precaution was ritualistic, every measure reinforcing the sanctity of my temple. But still, the thrill of near discovery sharpened me. A neighbor's shadow, a delivery man lingering too long, a patron suspicious of the private tasting. Each encounter was a brush with catastrophe that only deepened my focus, my skill, my mania. The act of serving was exquisite theater. Plates arrived with elegance, slices aligned like anatomy diagrams, sauces tracing subtle patterns reminiscent of veins and arteries. Patrons murmured praises, oblivious to the origins of the flavors that delighted them. Their ignorance, their trust, was the final brushstroke on the canvas. I observed, cataloged, savored. Not merely the taste, but the perfection of the act itself. Yet even as I achieved mastery, the hunger persisted, gnawing at me, demanding more. It became an obsession so complete that sleep offered no relief. My dreams were filled with knives, flames, meat, and whispers of flavor. The line between reality and ritual blurred. The kitchen, the hunt, the preparation. They existed in every moment, in every thought. I had become entirely consumed, utterly dependent on the act of creation born from death. I began to philosophize more deeply, justifying each act, each ritual. Humans are the ultimate ingredient, I told myself. Complex, nuanced, unparalleled. To consume is not destruction, but preservation. To cook is not murder, but homage. To serve is not deceit, but celebration. In my hands, life and death, horror and beauty, flavor and obsession existed in perfect harmony. Late at night, the apartment quiet except for the hum of refrigeration and the crackle of the stove. I would stand over my creations, hands poised on knives, eyes gleaming in reflection, whispering praises, offering thanks, imagining conversations with those gone. I had become predator, priest, artist, and God. Nothing beyond these walls could touch me. Nothing could understand. Nothing could challenge the perfection I had wrought. And so I continued. Multiple hunts, simultaneous preparations, endless experimentation. Each act sharper, each flavor more intense, each ritual more elaborate. The knives gleamed, the flames danced, the freezers promised more. Patrons consumed without knowledge, without comprehension, without awareness. I reveled in their praise and their ignorance. And in the quiet, I felt complete. The final realization settled over me like a crown. Perfection demands obsession. Obsession demands sacrifice. Sacrifice demands hunger. And hunger is eternal. I am eternal. The kitchen, my cathedral. The knives, my choir. The meat, my scripture. The hunger, my purpose. And in the quiet, as the city slept oblivious outside my walls, I smiled, because the next meal is never the last. That's it. This is the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, PLS, like and subscribe. Also comment what would you do in this situation. That's it. This was Nightmare Vault. Goodbye and have a scary night.